August 18, 1966. Phu Tu Province, South Vietnam. 108 Australian soldiers are dying in a rubber plantation. The rain falls like curtains of steel. Thunder masks the screams. Lightning illuminates faces pale with fear and black with mud. D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, is surrounded by more than 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. The Australians are down to their last bullets. Some men count 3 rounds. Some count 2. Some count 1. In 15 minutes, maybe less, the ammunition. Then the enemy closes in. Then it ends. But high above the storm, through clouds thick as concrete, 2 unarmed helicopters are coming. The pilots cannot see the ground. They cannot see each other. They navigate by compass and desperate radio calls from men about to die. The Viet Cong hear the rotors. They turn their weapons skyward, hundreds of rifles, dozens of machine guns, all firing into the grey chaos above the tree. The helicopters do not turn back. They drop through the cloud base at treetop height, rotors clipping branches, fuselage shaking from turbulence and bullets. Crewmen kick ammunition boxes into the rain. The boxes tumble into Australian hands. Men sob with relief. Magazines slam into rifle. The firing starts again. The Viet Cong, who believe victory was seconds away, watch their trapped enemy come back to life. And they know they have lost. This is the story of the resupply mission at Long Tan. The story of 2 pilots who flew into hell because 100 men needed them. The story of why the Viet Cong couldn't stop the RAAF from saving Long Tan. If you want more untold stories of courage from the Vietnam War, subscribe to Vietnam War Records and turn on notifications. We bring you the history they don't teach. Now let's go back to August 1966, to a rubber plantation in the rain, and understand how this moment changed everything. The Australian task force arrived in Phu Tu Province in May 1966. Their base, Nui Dat, sat in the middle of enemy territory. The Viet Cong controlled the villages. The North Vietnamese army moved through the jungle in battalion strength. The Australians were isolated, surrounded, and heavily outnumbered. The Americans, fighting further north, employed massive firepower and large unit sweeps. They moved loudly. They fought openly. They relied on helicopters, artillery, and airstrikes to compensate for their visibility. The Australians had learned different lessons from Malaya, from Borneo, from decades of jungle warfare against communist insurgents. They patrolled in small groups. They tracked the enemy for days before striking. They used stealth, patience, and discipline. The Viet Cong had American units could be heard from kilometers away. Australians appeared without warning. American patrols followed trails. Australians moved through the undergrowth, invisible and silent. The Viet Cong began to fear the Australians in a way they did not fear the Americans. Captured documents from 1966 describe Australian soldiers as ghosts, as hunters who could not be escaped, as men who understood the jungle better than the Viet Cong themselves. But on August 17, 1966, the Viet Cong decided to make a statement. They wanted to bloody the Australians. They wanted to prove that even the elite jungle fighters could be beaten. That night, Viet Cong mortar teams crept close to Nui Dat base and launched a barrage. Shells exploded inside the Australian perimeter. 1 man died, others were wounded. The attack was brief but precise. The Viet Cong withdrew into the darkness before the Australians could respond. It was an insult, a challenge, a declaration. The Australians responded immediately. The next morning, August 18th, D Company was ordered to patrol east from Nui Dat toward the Long Tan rubber plantation. Their mission was to find the mortar teams, track them, and destroy them. D Company was led by Major Harry Smith, a hard, experienced officer who demanded excellence and discipline. His men trusted him. They were good soldiers, well-trained, well-led. But there were 108 men walking into a trap designed for thousands. The rubber plantation at Long Tan was a killing ground. The trees stood in rows, planted by French colonists decades before. The ground was flat and open beneath the canopy. Visibility was good. Cover was minimal. It was perfect terrain for an ambush, and the Viet Cong had been waiting there for the D445 Viet Cong Battalion, the 275th Viet elements of the North Vietnamese Army. More than 2,000 soldiers dug into positions, camouflaged, disciplined, and ready. They had watched the Australians leave Nui Dat. They knew the Australians would come. They let them walk deep into the plantation. Then they opened. At 16:08 hours, the shooting started. 11 platoon leading the advance ran straight into a small Viet Cong unit. The Australians returned fire. The Viet Cong withdrew. 11 platoon pursued. It was exactly what the enemy wanted. The platoon ran forward, chasing the fleeing Viet Cong, and suddenly the world exploded. Automatic weapons fire erupted from three sides. Hundreds of muzzle flashes lit the shadows beneath the trees. Bullets snapped through the air like whips. Men fell, others dove for cover behind the thin rubber trunks. Major Smith realized instantly what had happened. This was not a mortar team. This was not a small unit. This was a prepared ambush by a force 10, maybe 20 times larger than his company. He ordered his men to form a defensive position. The platoons pulled back, forming a rough circle in the mud. They dug shallow scrapes with entrenching tools and bare hands. They fired controlled bursts at the enemy, closing in from the north, east, and west. The Viet Cong advanced in waves, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. Barely. Then the rain came. Not a shower, not a squall. A monsoon storm that turned the sky black and the ground into a swamp. Visibility dropped to 50 meters, then 30, then 20. The Australians could barely see the enemy. They fired at muzzle flashes. They fired at movement. They fired at sounds. The thunder was so loud that men could not hear their own rifles. Lightning cracked overhead, freezing the battlefield in white snapshots. Viet Cong soldiers silhouetted against the trees. Australians reloading in the mud, bodies sprawled in the water. The storm turned the battle into chaos, but it also saved the Australians. The rain made visibility so poor that the Viet Cong could not coordinate their assault. They could not see Australian positions clearly. They advanced blindly, running into interlocking fields of fire, dying in groups. But the Australians were dying too. 18 men would not leave that plantation alive. 24 more were wounded, some critically, and the ammunition was running out. By 1700 hours, the situation was desperate. Some soldiers were down to half a magazine, others had less. The machine gunners were rationing bursts, firing only when the enemy came close. The riflemen fired single shots, conserving every round. Major Smith radioed back to Nui Dat. His message was clear. We are surrounded. We are outnumbered. We are running out of ammunition. We need resupply now or we will be overrun. At Nui Dat, the commanders faced an impossible decision. The relief force, a company mounted in armored personnel carriers, was already rolling toward Long Tan, but they were at least 30 minutes away, maybe more in the storm and mud. D Company did not have 30 minutes. Artillery fire was keeping the Viet Cong at a distance, but artillery could not deliver bullets. Someone had to fly ammunition to D Company. Someone had to go into that storm, into that ambush, and drop supplies to men surrounded by 2,000 enemy soldiers. The only aircraft available were the RAAF Iroquois helicopters of No. 9 Squadron, unarmed transports. No gunships, no escorts, no door guns. Just thin-skinned helicopters flown by men who knew that flying into Long Tan meant flying into concentrated enemy fire with no way to shoot back. Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley was 27 years old. He had been flying helicopters for years. He was calm, precise, and fearless. When the mission was explained to him, he did not hesitate. He volunteered. So did Flying Officer Bob Grandin. So did their crews. Warrant Officer Jack Thurgar, Corporal Phil Dobson. They loaded the helicopters with ammunition. Boxes of 7.62mm rounds for the L1A1 rifles, belts for the N60 machine guns, grenades, magazines. 3,000 rounds total, enough to keep D Company fighting. Enough to save them. If the helicopters could get through. Riley and Grandin climbed into their cockpits. The rotors spun up, the turbines screamed. The Iroquois lifted off from Nui Dat and turned east, toward the storm, toward the guns, toward Long Tan. The pilots could not see the ground. The cloud base was at treetop level. Rain hammered the windscreens. Wind shook the airframes. They flew by compass heading and radio calls from Major Smith's signalers on the ground. The Australians popped smoke grenades to mark their position. Coloured smoke rose into the rain, barely visible, a thin thread of hope in the grey chaos. Riley descended through the clouds. The altimeter unwound. 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. The treetops appeared suddenly dark green and close enough to touch. Riley leveled off just above the canopy. The rotor wash bent the branches. Leaves and rain swirled in the downwash. He could see smoke ahead. Red smoke. Australian position? He pushed the helicopter forward, skimming the trees, and suddenly the Viet Cong saw him. Rifles turned upward. Machine guns opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. Green and red lines in the storm. Bullets punched through the fuselage. The helicopter shook. Riley did not flinch. He flew straight toward the smoke, straight into the fire. Behind him, Grandin followed in the second Iroquois, matching Riley's altitude, matching his course, flying into the same hell. In the back, Thurgar and Dobson crouched by the open doors. The ammunition boxes were stacked between them. The wind screamed through the cabin. Rain lashed their faces. Below, they could see muzzle flashes, hundreds of them. A forest of fire reaching up toward the helicopters. Riley brought the Iroquois to a hover over the Australian position. He could not land. The ground was too muddy. The enemy was too close. Landing meant staying still. Staying still meant dying. So he hovered at 50 feet, rotors clawing the air, and Thurgar and Dobson began kicking the ammunition boxes out the doors. The boxes tumbled through the rain and hit the ground among the Australians. Men scrambled forward, grabbing the boxes, tearing them open, hands shaking from adrenaline and relief. They pulled out magazines. They pulled out grenades. They reloaded. They stood up. They started firing again. Riley held the hover for 20 seconds. 30. Bullets snapped past the windscreen, the tail rotor, the engine cowling. Then he pulled power and climbed away, banking hard, disappearing back into the clouds. Grandin brought the second helicopter in immediately, following the same approach, the same hover, the same deadly dance above the trees. His crew kicked out the rest of the ammunition. More boxes fell into Australia. More rifles came back to life. The Viet Cong, who had been preparing for the final assault, suddenly faced a company that could fight again. The resupply mission took less than 3 minutes. 2 helicopters, 2 passes, 3,000 rounds delivered. Not one Australian on the ground was hit by a falling box. Not one helicopter was shot down. Riley and Grandin climbed back through the storm and returned to Nui Dat. Their aircraft were riddled with bullet holes. The crews were soaked and shaking, but they had done it. They had flown into an ambush, hovered under fire, and delivered the ammunition that saved D Company. On the ground at Long Tan, the battle continued. But now the Australians had bullets. Now they could hold. The artillery kept firing. The rain kept falling. And at 1800 hours, the armored personnel carriers of A Company smashed into the Viet Cong from the west, machine guns blazing, crushing enemy positions under their tracks. The Viet Cong broke. They withdrew into the jungle, dragging their dead and wounded. They left behind 245 confirmed bodies, hundreds more wounded. Weapons, equipment, blood trails leading into the darkness D Company had held. Barely. 18 Australians were dead. 24 were wounded. But they had held. The question is not whether the RAAF pilots' courage is assumed. The question is why the Viet Cong could. Why? With hundreds of rifles and machine guns, with 2,000 soldiers on the ground, with total tactical superiority, the Viet Cong failed to shoot down 2 unarmed helicopters flying at treetop height. The answer lies in the nature of the storm, the speed of the mission, and the limitations of the Viet Cong's weapons and training. Start with the weather. The monsoon storm was not a minor inconvenience. It was a tactical factor that changed everything. Visibility was less than 50 meters. Rain fell so hard it stung exposed skin. Wind gusts shook the helicopters and threw off aimed fire from the ground. The Viet Cong soldiers dug into positions around D Company, were focused on the Australians in front of them. They were not looking up. They were not expecting helicopters in this weather. When the Iroquois appeared, they appeared suddenly. Rotor noise was masked by thunder. Visual acquisition was delayed by the low cloud and rain. The Viet Cong had perhaps 10 to 15 seconds to react, to swing their weapons skyward, to aim, to fire. Firing at a helicopter is not like firing at a man. A helicopter is fast. It is 3-dimensional. It is moving in multiple axes simultaneously. Forward, up, down, sideways. The pilot is constantly adjusting altitude and speed. The target is not stationary. It is not predictable. Most infantry soldiers are not trained to it. The Viet Cong were excellent jungle fighters. They were masters of ambush, but aerial gunnery requires a completely different skill set. It requires adjusting for range and speed, compensating for the movement of the aircraft and the arc of the bullet. Most soldiers simply point and shoot. They aim directly at the helicopter. By the time the bullet reaches that point, The helicopter has moved. This is not cowardice. This is not incompetence. This is the reality of engaging a moving aerial target with iron. Even trained anti-aircraft gunners struggle to hit helicopters in good conditions. In a monsoon storm, with limited visibility, with the target appearing and disappearing in seconds, the odds of a direct hit drop dramatically. The Viet Cong did hit the helicopters. Multiple rounds struck both aircraft, but hitting an aircraft and downing an aircraft are very different things. The Iroquois is a surprisingly tough machine. It has redundant systems. It can fly with damaged and non-critical air. The fuel tanks are self-sealing. The rotor blades can take hits and keep turning. The pilots and crew are protected by armored seats. Unless a bullet hits the engine, the transmission, the tail rotor gearbox, or the pilot, the helicopter keeps flying, and in a fast-moving engagement lasting 30 seconds, scoring a critical hit is extraordinarily difficult. The Viet Cong fired hundreds of rounds at the helicopters. Perhaps a dozen connected. None hit anything vital. The helicopters survived. This was not luck. This was probability. This was the reality of small arms fire against fast-moving aircraft in terrible conditions. The speed of the mission was also critical. Riley and Grandin were over the Australian position for less than 90 seconds combined. Approach, hover, drop, climb out. The Viet Cong had no time to organize concentrated fire, no time to reposition heavy weapons, no time to adjust. By the time they understood what was happening, the helicopters were gone. This is the essence of close air support in a high-threat environment. Speed equals survival. The longer you stay, the more likely you die. Riley and Grandin understood this instinctively. They did not loiter. They did not make multiple passes to improve accuracy. They came in fast, dropped the load, and got out. The ammunition did not land perfectly. Some boxes fell outside the Australian perimeter. Some burst, but enough landed where they were needed. Enough reached the men who were down to their last rounds, and that was enough. The Australian artillery also played a crucial role while the helicopters were inbound. The gunners at Nui Dat fired suppressive missions around D Company's position. Shells exploded in the rubber plantation, forcing the Viet Cong to take cover, disrupting their fields of fire, creating a brief window of reduced visibility and reduced enemy fire. The artillery could not create a safe corridor. There is no such thing as a safe corridor in an ambush, but they could reduce the volume of fire by a fraction. And in a mission measured in seconds, a fraction is the difference between success and catastrophe. The timing was precise. The gunners ceased fire seconds before the helicopters arrived, ensuring no friendly aircraft flew into their own artillery. Then they resumed fire immediately after the helicopters departed, keeping the Viet Cong suppressed, preventing them from overrunning the Australian position now that the resupply had arrived. From the Viet Cong perspective, the helicopter resupply was a psychological and tactical disaster. They had executed a near-perfect ambush. They had trapped a company of elite. They had inflicted casualties. They had brought the Australians to the edge of collapse. Ammunition exhaustion is the death of an infantry unit. Once the bullets run out, courage and training mean nothing. The enemy closes in with bayonets and grenades, and the fight is over in minutes. The Viet Cong knew this. They were preparing for the final assault. They were moving forward, ready to finish D Company, ready to claim the biggest victory against the Australians since their arrival in Phuoc Thu. Then the helicopters came, through a storm that should have grounded all aircraft, at an altitude that should have made them easy targets, dropping ammunition that brought the Australians back from the dead. The Viet Cong soldiers crouched in the mud, soaked and exhausted, watched the helicopters disappear into the clouds. They watched the Australians reload. They watched the fire from the Australian positions intensify, and they knew the moment had passed. The ambush had failed. Captured Viet Cong documents from late 1966, translated by Australian intelligence, described the Long Tan battle as a significant tactical failure. The documents acknowledged that the Australians were nearly defeated. They acknowledged that the helicopter resupply prevented the collapse. One Viet Cong officer, interrogated after his capture in 1967, stated that the inability to stop the helicopters was a critical mistake. He said his unit had fired at the aircraft but could not bring them down. He said the Australians fought like demons after the resupply arrived. He said his battalion lost more than 100 men and gained nothing. This was not propaganda. This was not exaggeration. This was a professional soldier, trained by the North Vietnamese army, acknowledging that his enemy had outfought him, that the Australians, with their artillery and their helicopters and their discipline, had turned a certain defeat into a bloody stalemate. and stalemates in insurgent warfare are victories for the conventional force. The Viet Cong changed their tactics after Long Tan. They stopped trying to engage Australian units in prolonged firefights near Nui Dat. They realized that the Australians could call in artillery within minutes, that helicopters could resupply or reinforce under conditions that should have been impossible, that the Australians did not fight like the Americans. The Americans relied on firepower and numbers. The Australians relied on skill and coordination. The Viet Cong began to avoid Australian patrols when possible. They set ambushes further from Nui Dat, in areas where helicopters and artillery could not respond quickly. They used hit-and-run tactics, striking fast and withdrawing before the Australians could react. This was a recognition of reality. The Australians were too dangerous to fight on their terms. Long Tan proved that. The helicopter resupply proved that. 2 unarmed aircraft, flown by men who refused to abandon their brothers on the ground, had changed the outcome of the battle. The Viet Cong learned. They adapted, but they never forgot. Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley and Flying Officer Bob Grandin were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions at Long Tan. The citation reads in part that they displayed exceptional courage and skill in the face of extreme danger, that they flew into heavy enemy fire in weather conditions that precluded normal flight operations to deliver critical supplies to Australian forces in contact, that their actions directly contributed to the successful defense of D Company and the defeat of a numerically superior enemy force. The citations are understated. Military awards always are. They do not convey the terror of flying blind through a monsoon storm. They do not convey the sound of bullets hitting the fuselage. They do not convey the sight of a rubber plantation filled with muzzle flashes and the knowledge that you are about to fly into the center of that fire with no weapons and no armor and no way to fight back. Riley and Grandin were not fearless. No sane man is fearless in combat, but they were disciplined, they were skilled, and they understood that fear is irrelevant when men are dying and you are the only one who can save them. The crews, Warrant Officer Jack Thurger and Corporal Phil Dobson, received mentions in dispatches. They were the men who kicked the ammunition out the doors, who crouched in the open cabin, rain and wind and bullets screaming around them, and shoved heavy boxes into the void, trusting that the pilots would hold the helicopter steady, trusting that the Australians below would get the supplies, trusting that they would survive the next 30 seconds. Helicopter crews in Vietnam had one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. They flew every day. They flew into landing zones under fire. They extracted wounded under fire. They resupplied units under fire. Many did not come home. The crews at Long Tan came home. But they were lucky. Skill kept them alive. So did speed. So did the storm. But luck was part of it. And every helicopter crewman in Vietnam knew that luck runs out. Major Harry Smith, the D Company commander, was awarded the Military Cross for his leadership at Long Tan. In his post-battle report, he specifically credited the RAAF helicopter crews with saving his company. He wrote that without the resupply, D Company would have been overrun within 15 to 20 minutes, that his men were down to an average of 2 magazines per man, that some soldiers had less, that the machine gunners were rationing ammunition to the point where they could no longer provide effective suppressive fire. He wrote that the arrival of the helicopters and the ammunition they delivered restored his company's ability to fight, that the men's morale, which had been cracking under the strain of ammunition exhaustion and overwhelming enemy pressure, recovered instantly, that the psychological impact of knowing they were not abandoned, that someone was willing to fly into that hell to help them, was as important as the bullets. Smith was not a sentimental man. He was a professional soldier who demanded facts and discipline. His report is dry, precise, and factual, which makes his praise of the helicopter crews all the more powerful. The Battle of Long Tan became the defining moment of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. It was the largest single engagement fought by Australian forces in Vietnam. It demonstrated that a small, well-trained, well-led infantry company, supported by artillery and air mobility, could defeat a force 20 times its size. It proved that Australian tactics, learned in Malaya and Borneo, were effective against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. It showed that Australians could fight and win in the worst conditions imaginable. And it showed that Australian soldiers, pilots, and crews would not abandon each other. That when men were in contact, when ammunition was running out, when death was minutes away, someone would come. Even through a monsoon, even through enemy fire, even when survival was a coin toss, someone would come. The helicopter resupply at Long Tan was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was the result of training, courage, coordination, and the refusal to accept defeat. Riley and Grandin were exceptional pilots, but they were not superhuman. They flew machines that could be shot down. They made decisions that could have killed them. They succeeded because they were skilled, because the weather degraded enemy fire, because the mission was fast, and because the Australian artillery created a brief window of opportunity. Remove any one of those factors, and the helicopters do not make it. The D Company is overrun. 108 men die in them. The Viet Cong win the largest victory of the war against Australian forces. The psychological impact on Australian operations in Phuoc Tu province is catastrophic, but that did not happen. The helicopters made it. The ammunition arrived. D Company held. The Viet Cong withdrew, and the legend was born. The story of Long Tan is told in Australian military schools. It is studied by infantry officers. It is remembered on August 18th every year. Veterans gather, families remember. The names of the 18 dead are read aloud. The survivors, fewer each year, stand in silence. They remember the rain, the mud, the fear, the sound of helicopters coming through the storm, the relief when the ammunition boxes hit the ground, the knowledge that they were not alone, that someone cared enough to risk everything. The RAAF pilots who flew that mission did not think they were heroes. They thought they were doing their job. Helicopter pilots extract wounded. They resupply units in contact. That is the mission. That is the duty. The fact that this particular mission was flown in a monsoon into an ambush at treetop height under fire did not change the duty. It only changed the risk. And risk is part of the job. But the Viet Cong saw it differently. They saw an enemy that refused to quit, that adapted, that coordinated, that used technology and firepower and discipline to overcome numerical inferiority. They saw helicopters that could fly in weather that grounded their own limited air assets. They saw artillery that responded within minutes. The Viet Cong were excellent soldiers. They were brave. They were determined. They believed in their cause. But at Long Tan they learned that belief is not enough, that courage is not enough, that numbers are not enough. The Australians had all those things plus training, plus support, plus the absolute refusal to leave their brothers behind. And that combination was unstoppable. The resupply mission at Long Tan is one of the great untold stories of the Vietnam War. It is overshadowed by the battle itself, by the statistics, by the awards. But without the resupply, there is no battle. There is only a massacre. The mission lasted less than 3 minutes. It involved 2 helicopters and 4 crewmen. It delivered 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and it saved 108 men. That is not hyperbole. That is not exaggeration. That is the assessed judgment of the commander on the ground, of the intelligence officers who analyzed the battle, of the historians who studied the records. The ammunition arrived at the critical moment. It allowed D Company to continue fighting until the relief force arrived. Without it, D Company collapses. The mathematics are simple. The outcome is certain. Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley died in 2017, age 78. Flying Officer Bob Grandin is still alive as of this recording, living quietly in Australia. Warrant Officer Jack Thurger passed away in 2004. Corporal Phil Dobson died in 1997. They did not seek fame. They did not write books. They did not give many interviews. They were professional military men who did their duty and then moved on with their lives. But the men of D Company never forgot them. At reunions, when the stories are told, the helicopter resupply is always mentioned. The old soldiers, grey and bent, remember the sound of the rotors, the sight of the ammunition boxes tumbling through the rain, the feeling of a fresh magazine slapping into a rifle, the knowledge that they would live another hour, maybe another day, maybe long enough to get home. Some of them did get home, some of them did not. But all of them owed their chance to 2 pilots who flew into hell because it was their duty. The Viet Cong could not stop the RAAF pilots from saving Long Tan, because stopping them required shooting down 2 helicopters moving at high speed, at low altitude, in a monsoon storm, in less than 90 seconds. It required trained anti-aircraft gunners. It required heavy weapons positioned for aerial engagement. It required luck. The Viet Cong had courage. They had numbers. They had good positions. They had surprise. But they did not have the training or the weapons to reliably engage helicopters in those conditions. They fired hundreds of rounds. They hit both aircraft. But they could not bring them down. And that failure cost them the battle. That failure cost them 245 dead. That failure cost them the psychological advantage. After Long Tan, the Viet Cong knew that the Australians could not be trapped, that even when surrounded, even when outnumbered 20-1, even when the ammunition was running out, the Australians would find a way. Artillery would come, helicopters would come, reinforcements would come, and the Viet Cong would pay in blood. This is not a story about technology. The Iroquois was not a superweapon. It was a standard utility helicopter, unarmed and vulnerable. This is not a story about superior firepower. Two helicopters do not change the balance of firepower in a battle involving 3,000 soldiers. This is a story about courage, skill, and the refusal to accept defeat. It is a story about pilots who flew when they should not have been able to fly, about crews who stood in open doors and kicked ammunition into the storm, about soldiers on the ground who held when they should have been overrun, about commanders who coordinated artillery, helicopters, and infantry in the middle of chaos, about the Australian way of war, which is not about size or firepower, but about professionalism and the absolute commitment to never leaving a man behind. The helicopter resupply at Long Tan was not the longest mission of the Vietnam War. It was not the most decorated. It was not the most famous. But it was one of the most important. It changed the outcome of the largest battle fought by Australian forces in Vietnam. It saved the lives of men who went on to fight for years. It demonstrated capabilities that influenced Australian doctrine for decades, and it sent a message to the Viet Cong that they could not win by trapping Australian units, that the Australians would come for their own. That distance, weather, and enemy fire were obstacles, not barriers, that the RAAF and the Australian Army were one force, coordinated and committed, and that commitment was stronger than fear. Today, the Long Tan Cross stands in the rubber plantation where D Company fought. It marks the place where 18 Australians died, where 24 were wounded, where 108 men held against 2,000, where 2 helicopters flew through a monsoon and delivered hope in the form of ammunition boxes. The cross is simple, white concrete, names engraved. It stands alone among the rubber trees, which are older now, thicker, still in rows. The ground is quiet, the rain still comes, the storms still roll across Viet Cong province, but the guns are silent. The soldiers are gone, only the cross remains, and the memory of what happened there on August 18, 1966. The men who fought at Long Tan are old now. The youngest is in his 70s. The oldest are in their 80s. Every year, there are fewer. Every year, the reunions are smaller. But the story does not fade. It is taught to new generations of Australian soldiers. It is remembered by families. It is studied by historians. And it is told to people like you who want to understand what happened in Vietnam, who want to know why the Australians were different, why the Viet Cong feared them, why a small force could defeat a large one, why courage matters, why skill matters, why the refusal to quit matters. Long Tan answers all those questions. And at the center of the answer, flying through the storm, are 2 helicopters crewed by men who would not turn back. The Viet Cong could not stop them. Not with rifles, not with machine guns, not with numbers, not with tactical advantage. They could not stop them because stopping them required the will to shoot down men who were risking everything to save their brothers. And even the Viet Cong, brave and determined as they were, could not overcome that. The helicopters came, the ammunition fell, the Australians fought on, and the Viet Cong withdrew into the jungle, carrying their dead, knowing they had lost. Not because they were cowards, not because they were weak, but because they faced an enemy that refused to be beaten. An enemy that understood that wars are not won by the side with the most soldiers, but by the side that will not quit. If you want more stories like this, stories of courage and sacrifice from the Vietnam War, subscribe to Vietnam War Records. We research the battles they don't teach, we tell the stories they don't tell, we honor the men who fought on all sides with the truth. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the real history of the Vietnam War. This is Vietnam War Records, bringing you the truth, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember the men who flew into the storm.